was supposed to be the usual college Halloween, a spectacle of cheap thrills and cheaper liquor. I'm Liam, and that night I was just a walking cliché, a vampire in a velvet cloak that already smelled faintly of beer, navigating the annual Monster Mash at Sigma Beta Kappa. The frat house was a claustrophobic pit of noise, heat, and synthetic fog. The bass drum was a physical force, hitting my chest with a steady thump-thump-thump that was part of the fun, part of the danger. I was riding that perfect wave of buzz and confidence, especially after I managed to corner Chloe by the stereo. She was incredible, done up as a black widow, sleek black jumpsuit, dramatic makeup, and a predatory smile. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of stale sweat, spilled beer, and a sickly sweet cherry red aroma that clung to everything. That smell led directly to the centerpiece of the main room, the punch bowl. It was immense, a ceramic cauldron filled with a lurid, glowing crimson fluid. Someone had gone to the effort of carving peeled apples into grotesque eyeballs, which bobbed lazily in the toxic-looking mixture. It was the lifeblood of the party, literally and figuratively. Everyone circled it, dipping their plastic cups into the scarlet well. "Don't worry," I told Chloe, handing her a fresh cup. "It's 90% Kool-Aid, 10% bottom-shelf vodka. You'll be fine." She laughed, the sound just barely audible over the relentless throbbing of the bass. "It looks like something that could dissolve concrete." "Happy Halloween," I toasted. I took a long, thirsty gulp. It was sweet, almost aggressively so, masking any bitterness from the cheap alcohol. But as I swallowed, there was a strange aftertaste, not of sugar, but something metallic and sharp, like licking a penny. I frowned but immediately dismissed it. It was frat punch. It was supposed to taste wrong. Chloe drank hers down faster, her eyes still sparkling under the flickering neon green strobe lights. For the next hour, everything was perfect chaos. The heat was oppressive, making my plastic vampire fangs stick uncomfortably to my gums. I danced with Chloe. We shouted nonsense at each other. The party was in its sweaty primal climax. Then, just as the clock hit midnight, the wave broke. It started subtly. The laughter didn't sound right. It was too shrill, too brittle. I saw a guy dressed as Captain America suddenly stumble, leaning heavily against a speaker, his face no longer red with exertion, but bleached a sickly, dreadful white. A girl near the punch bowl, the one wearing the shimmering mermaid costume, let out a small, strangled gasp and doubled over, clutching her stomach like a vice. The relentless bass felt less like music and more like a warning drum. Thump, thump, thump. A searing fire erupted in my own throat, spreading instantly down my esophagus and into my chest. It wasn't the burn of hard liquor. It was raw, corrosive pain. I stumbled back, grabbing the shoulder of a passing guest. My hand felt clammy and cold. "Something's wrong," I choked out, the words scratching my dry throat. Chloe had stopped moving. She stood motionless next to me, her hand pressed against her ribs. Her breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. "Liam, it hurts," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "It's that punch. It tastes metallic, like rusty razor blades." I pushed through the now thickening crowd toward the nearest reflection, a grimy window overlooking the street. The sight that greeted me instantly erased any shred of remaining drunken euphoria. My face, caught in the awful blue strobe light, was no longer just flushed. My skin was erupting in tiny, agonizing crimson blisters, popping and weeping immediately as if acid had been splashed across my cheeks. It looked like a fast-moving, flesh-eating infection, staining my costume a deeper, realer red than any stage blood. Mass hysteria hit like a tidal wave. Someone screamed, a high, pure note of terror, and that was the trigger. People realized the sickening taste, the sudden cramping, the debilitating nausea was not just bad booze. It was poison. The room, a second ago a blur of dancing bodies, became a stampede of terror. Costumes tore, masks flew off, and the frantic scramble to get to the narrow front door was horrific. The heavy thumping bass was now the sound of pure, inescapable panic. I felt my legs give way. The force of the panic-stricken crowd swept me aside, and I hit the floor near a sofa. I couldn't breathe, the fire in my chest consuming me, making my movements sluggish and useless. The floor was sticky, but not just with beer. I watched, paralyzed as a stream of dark, viscous fluid, blood, began to leak from the mouth of the mermaid girl who had collapsed earlier, pooling around the ridiculous fins of her costume. Chloe was still standing nearby, swaying. I reached for her, my fingers twitching.
Chloe, run!
She turned toward me, her beautiful black widow makeup now smeared with tears and a thin coppery trickle escaping the corner of her lips. Her eyes met mine, filled with pure, devastating realization. It was him, she mumbled, her voice catching on a gurgle. The punch. He made it. Then she crumpled, not gently but like a puppet whose strings were cut, hitting the floor with a wet, heavy thud that even the music couldn't drown out. I lay there, utterly helpless, watching the kaleidoscope of panicked legs rush past my face. My breath was a ragged, failing thing. My own blood-blistered skin felt like it was dissolving against the damp, cold frat house carpet. The punch. The lurid, festive red punch. It was no longer a party drink. It was a mass grave, and the horrific, cold reality that slammed into my dying brain was this. The killer was not only not running, but they were still here, dressed like everyone else, watching the slaughter. Through the gaps in the trampling feet, I desperately scanned the faces of those who hadn't fled. The lights pulsed, blue, then red, red, red. In the deep shadow of the kitchen doorway, away from the screaming and the light, I saw a figure. They were dressed in a simple dark executioner's hood, their face hidden, their hands casually crossed. They weren't moving. They weren't running. And as the final agonizing convulsion seized my body, I saw the executioner's head tilt just slightly, a gesture that I knew, with the last vestiges of my consciousness, was a silent, satisfied smile. The thump, thump, thump of the bass intensified, mixing with the ragged final thump, thump of my own failing heart. It was the last sound I ever heard, the soundtrack to my own horrific, blood-soaked end, leaving me trapped forever in the knowledge that the poisoner was the only one left to clean up the crimson mess. To clean up the crimson mess. The official name was the Obsidian Manor Gala, but everyone on campus just called it the Blood Money Ball. It was held in that infamous, decaying Gilded Age mansion down by the river, the one the university supposedly owned but never maintained. They only opened it once a year for the Halloween bash, and the real draw wasn't the overpriced champagne or the suffocating humidity. It was the $5,000 prize for best costume. That was my whole reason for being there. I'm Evelyn. I wasn't interested in the usual slutty nurses or tired superheroes. I needed that cash. So for 3 weeks I'd lived and breathed leatherworking and historical research, resulting in my masterpiece, a terrifyingly accurate Victorian-era plague doctor. The heavy oil-treated leather coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the gloves, and most importantly, the grotesque beak mask. It was heavy, hot, and smelled perpetually of cured hide and linseed oil, but it was perfect. I felt like an ominous walking sculpture of historical doom. Stepping into the main ballroom was like entering a gilded cage. The air, already thick with the scent of 1,000 bodies and cheap fog machine vapor, was strangely chilled near the marble archways. Everyone joked about the manor's history, the whispered tales of dark rituals, the disappearances, the fire that supposedly claimed the original owner's family in the 1920s. Tonight, those stories felt less like folklore and more like atmospheric pressure. I moved slowly, letting the heavy leather of my coat shift with an unnerving creak. The mask amplified sounds, the distant hollow echo of every laugh, the grinding texture of hundreds of dancing shoes on the polished floor. I was constantly aware of eyes on me, not just because the costume was a spectacle, but because I was the heavy favorite. I could practically smell the victory. The main focus, besides the dance floor, was Marcus. He was dressed as a grotesque carnival clown, huge, oversized suit, perpetually sweating under white grease paint, with a bright red painted smile that stretched too wide. Marcus was known for being overly theatrical, doing clumsy, exaggerated tumbles and pratfalls for attention. For a while, he was performing near the central fountain, but even his antics felt frantic tonight, slightly off-key, like a nervous tic rather than genuine performance. The judges, a panel of pretentious art majors, were gathering near the grand staircase. The contest was about to begin. The relentless electronic music that had been pounding for hours suddenly dropped to a deep, sustained pulse. The lights dimmed, bathing the room in a sickly, pulsating amber glow. A collective cheer went up, vibrating in the leather of my mask, and then, the sound that shattered the illusion, a piercing, absolute shriek. It wasn't a party scream, not the excited fake horror of a girl startled by a plastic spider. This was a sound ripped straight from a throat, laced with pure agonizing terror and surprise. It cut through the bass like a surgical blade. The music stuttered, then went silent. The humid electric atmosphere froze solid. Everyone turned toward the sound, which had come from the far wall, near a velvet-draped alcove. Marcus the Clown was there, but he wasn't performing. He was thrashing on the marble floor. It wasn't a pratfall. His movements were too sharp, too violent. His body was convulsing in short, painful bursts, his limbs flailing unnaturally. His wide, painted smile was still plastered on his face, but now it was horrifyingly framed by something darker, wetter. Fresh arterial spray. It was everywhere, a shocking, bright red that dwarfed the red of his painted mouth and the fake blood dripping from other costumes. He was being attacked, brutally, violently. But by what? I pushed closer, the sound of my heavy leather boots clopping on the marble feeling deafeningly loud. I saw the wounds. They weren't single stab wounds. They were repeated shallow-looking gashes that crisscrossed his torso under the thin cotton of his clown suit. The cuts were sickeningly clean, almost surgical, yet inflicted with savage speed. The crowd finally broke. The panic was instantaneous and absolute. People were scrambling, kicking, and clawing their way toward the main entrance. Masks abandoned, wigs flying, their own screaming becoming the only soundtrack. Where was the killer? I looked everywhere. There was no one near Marcus. No weapon on the floor, no figure fleeing the scene. It was as if he was being butchered by the air itself. I started to back away, the adrenaline flooding my system with pure, cold dread. I knew I needed to get out of the manor now. As I turned to join the stampede, the weight of my plague doctor coat suddenly felt wrong. Wrong and heavy. It started as a dull pressure across my ribs, like someone had placed a thick leather belt around my chest and was tightening it with slow, deliberate force. My breath caught in my beak mask. I instinctively tried to loosen the coat, fumbling with the heavy brass buckles, but my fingers were numb with terror. The leather groaned. It wasn't the sound of old material. It sounded like a thick rope being pulled taut over stone. The pressure increased exponentially, squeezing the air out of my lungs, forcing a gasp that was trapped uselessly inside the narrow beak. I stumbled, leaning against a cold, dust-covered statue of a grim angel. This isn't human, I thought, the realization hitting me with paralyzing clarity. This is not someone grabbing me. I felt the shape of the force pressing on me. Not two hands, but a solid, unseen circumference, crushing my ribcage. And then the pressure became something sharp. A sudden, intense stinging sensation ripped through the thick leather of the coat, right below my left shoulder blade. It was followed instantly by warmth, a wetness spreading against the cotton shirt beneath the coat. The unseen force wasn't just crushing me, it was piercing me. I tried to scream, but only a desperate, choked wheezing escaped my mouth. I clawed at my chest, feeling the thick, cold leather now slick with my own blood. My legs were kicking, but I was pinned against the angel statue by an invisible, murderous embrace. In my peripheral vision, through the hazy filter of the mask's eye holes, I saw it, a flicker of movement in the air where the pressure was strongest. Not a person, but a shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day, only cold and intensely focused on my body. The manor hadn't just held the party. It had provided the assailant. The leather around my chest gave one final, horrific crack, and a searing jolt of pain shot through my heart. I dropped to my knees, gasping, the pressure finally, mercifully easing just enough for me to take a panicked, shallow breath. I looked down. Where the buckles were, the heavy leather was slashed open, and beneath it, my white shirt was rapidly blooming red like a flower of poison. I had been opened up just like Marcus, but unlike him, I was still barely alive. I scrambled away from the wall, leaving a smear of blood on the cold marble angel. The ballroom was nearly empty now. A silent aftermath of spilled punch, ripped decorations, and the sickeningly beautiful pattern of Marcus's blood on the white floor. I tore off the cumbersome mask, finally gulping the thick air. The smell of copper and fear was overwhelming. I looked back at the alcove, and then at the ornate shadowed corners of the ballroom. I didn't see a killer, but I felt something heavy, ancient, and satisfied settle back into the silence. I didn't run to the exit. I fled to a tiny, dark washroom and locked the door, leaning my bloody back against the cold tile. I didn't call the police. I didn't check for survivors. I just listened to my own ragged breathing, knowing that in the Obsidian Manor, the history of dark rituals wasn't a joke to be told at a party. It was the unseen entity that had claimed its midnight prize, and it was still watching the stains dry. I can still feel the faint phantom pressure on my ribs whenever I put on a belt too tight, a silent reminder that I only escaped its grasp because it allowed me to. The atmosphere that night was supposed to be cozy, not catastrophic. It was a small, quiet Halloween get-together, just 6 of us, at my friend Jason's inherited house. We weren't frat party people. We were the ones who preferred slow-burn horror and bad B-movies. I'm Theodora, and I was dressed in a cheap, comfortable ghost costume, the white sheet already dragging dust from Jason's neglected hardwood floors. We'd exhausted the polite conversation and the supply of decent snacks by about 11, and that's when I made the fatal suggestion, the Ouija board. Jason had found it earlier in the week, tucked away in his grandmother's old trunk. It was a beautiful, intimidating piece of wood, glossy black, with ornate script and crescent moons carved into the edges. "Come on, just for kicks," I urged, holding it up. Max, my oldest friend, was the first to scoff. He was wearing a shaggy store-bought werewolf costume, shedding fake fur everywhere. He was a devout vocal skeptic. "It's a children's game, Theo. Pure idiomotor effect. You guys just want an excuse to hold hands." "Or maybe," I countered, trying to sound playful, "we want to prove your superior scientific mind wrong. Just sit, Max. Humor us." He rolled his eyes, but eventually relented, which is why we ended up in the basement. It was the perfect stage, damp, smelling faintly of mildew and concrete dust, draped with real thick cobwebs that Jason had supplemented with plastic skeletons and strings of flickering orange lights. It was authentically spooky without being genuinely terrifying. We settled around a rickety card table. Jason, his girlfriend Maya, and Max formed the circle with me. 2 other friends, Sarah and Ben, sat off to the side, claiming they'd just observe. I dimmed the string lights until they cast long, distorted shadows that danced with the humidity. The air was already heavy, but the moment all 6 of our fingers rested on the planchette, something shifted. It was instantaneous. The air didn't just grow heavy. It grew cold, a profound, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the basement's lack of heat. It felt like the temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in a single, silent second. I glanced at Max. Even through his thick fur cowl and painted snarl, I could see the sudden tension in his jaw. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. I swallowed hard, my voice a nervous thread. If there's anyone here with us, give us a sign." The planchette didn't hesitate. It didn't stutter or wobble, waiting for one of us to subconsciously push it. It glided fast and deliberate across the board, stopping dead center on the word, "Yes." A gasp rippled around the table. It wasn't a scream of terror, but of pure, disbelieving shock. Jason immediately jerked his hand away, whispering, "Okay, who did that?" "That was way too fast." "I didn't move it," Maya whispered back, her eyes wide. Max's voice was strained. "Nobody moved it." "I swear I didn't feel a push, I felt a pull." I placed my hand back on the smooth plastic of the planchette. It felt unnervingly cold beneath my fingertips. My heart was pounding, the sound echoing hollowly in the quiet basement. "All right," I managed, trying to sound authoritative. "Spirit, what is your name?" The planchette moved again, slowly at first, then picking up speed, dragging us along with it. It hit M, then A, then X, M-A-X. The reaction was immediate. A few nervous titters of laughter broke the silence. "See, I told you it was a joke," Jason said, relieved. "Max, you're subconsciously moving it, you narcissistic creep." But Max wasn't laughing. He was rigid, his face pale beneath the white werewolf muzzle. "I'm not moving it," he stated, his voice flat and unnaturally calm. "Stop saying that." "I'm not." The air thickened, the cold intensifying into a sensation of painful pressure, like being submerged in freezing water. The flickering orange lights above us began to hum, a high whining frequency that made my teeth ache. Then, the worst part, Max seized up. It wasn't a sudden muscle spasm. It was a total, terrifying transformation. His back arched like a bowstring being pulled taut, his head slamming back against the wall with a sickening thud. His eyes, previously skeptical and blue, rolled completely up, leaving only vast, disturbing fields of white. A low animalistic groan, a sound that wasn't human, rattled in his chest. The rest of us scrambled away from the table, tumbling backward in the dim light, knocking over a folding chair. The planchette remained glued to the center of the board. Max began to move, but he wasn't seizing. He was struggling, fighting something that held him with invisible, insurmountable force. His hands, clad in the thick, clumsy werewolf gloves, rose to his chest. His breathing became a choked, wet noise. Then he started to tear. He ripped at the cheap, fake fur of the costume with shocking, frantic violence, exposing the flannel shirt beneath. And then he didn't stop at the fabric. His claws, the dull plastic attachments of the costume, dug into his own skin. We could hear the horrific shredding sound, the thick, visceral noise of his nails tearing through tissue. It was efficient, fast, and driven by a power that was absolutely not his own. Max was weeping, silent tears streaming from his wide, white eyes, but his hands were ruthless, creating deep, ragged slashes across his sternum. The smell hit us next. The mildew and dust were instantly overwhelmed by the coppery, unmistakable stench of fresh, hot blood. It didn't just drip. It flowed from the terrible wounds his own hands had inflicted, staining the flannel shirt, then the werewolf fur, then the concrete floor. The blood bloomed outward, dark and thick, like a gruesome, poisonous flower opening in the dim light. I couldn't move. I was locked in a perfect, horrifying paralysis, watching my best friend become his own butcher. But the horror wasn't finished. Even as Max's breath hitched and grew shallow, even as he began to fall forward, the planchette on the table moved again. It didn't glide. It snapped. It shot across the board with such speed that the little plastic viewfinder was a blur. The invisible force that was mutilating Max was simultaneously using the board to communicate. 1 letter, 2, 3. We watched in paralyzed terror as it spelled out the word, directly connecting the brutality to the spiritual presence we had summoned, Traitor. The planchette settled on the final R just as Max's violent struggle ended. He collapsed onto the table, his blood splattering onto the board, soaking the letter R, and finally staining the plastic planchette itself. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the frantic, panicked whimpering of Maya. The message was clear, but the meaning was devastatingly ambiguous. Who was the spirit, and what had Max done to earn such a damning, bloody judgment? Sarah, Ben, and Jason finally found their legs and clawed their way up the stairs, leaving behind a trail of panic and dropped coats. I remained, huddled on the cold floor, staring at Max's body, at the horrific, self-inflicted wounds that covered his chest. The smell of his blood, so rich and metallic, was now the only thing I could sense. I looked back at the board, still dimly lit by the humming orange bulbs. The planchette was motionless, resting on the final, terrible word. Max was gone. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the basement air, that whatever ancient, angry entity we had contacted wasn't looking for a casual chat. It was looking for him, and whatever deep, dark secret Max had kept, whatever promise he had broken, whatever betrayal he had committed, it wasn't forgiven. It was only just paid for in his own blood, and the thing was still in the room, waiting for the rest of us to figure out which one of us was next. I never went back to that house, but the sound of scratching, the sound of nails on bone, is the only thing that ever plays when I close my eye. Plays when I close my eye. The Crimson Crow Loft Party was the kind of event where you went to lose yourself, not find trouble. It was Halloween night, and I was packed into the third-floor warehouse space with maybe 100 other bodies, all moving to a bass beat so heavy it made the floorboards vibrate beneath my feet. I'm Alex, and I was in the most uninspired costume possible, a black hoodie and a cheap plastic Venetian mask, mostly because I wanted to observe the chaos, not be part of it. The loft itself was industrial chic, exposed brick, high ceilings, and a massive wall of windows overlooking the city. The air was a thick, humid cocktail of sweat, cheap liquor, and the ozone scent of overworked speakers. I was leaning against the railing near the DJ booth, nursing a drink, enjoying the spectacle. The energy was electric, a kind of collective high that feels invincible. Near me, the most visible person in the room was a woman everyone was calling Flapper Girl. She wore a shimmering silver dress and a platinum blonde wig, twirling a long, elegant cigarette holder, basking in the strobe lights. She was glamorous, loud, and totally in her element. The DJ, a guy in a full mirrored disco helmet, was about to drop a song when the sound exploded into silence. The music didn't fade. It was cut. The power died completely, plunging the entire loft into an absolute sickening darkness. Not just dimness, but the kind of solid velvet black that swallows all light and leaves you instantly, horribly disoriented. At first, it was part of the fun. Everyone laughed, 100 nervous chuckles that bounced off the brick walls. "Party foul!" someone yelled. It was a classic, cheap party trick. Turn off the lights, wait for a couple of nervous screams, and turn them back on. But this darkness was different. It felt heavy, permanent. The initial laughter died almost instantly, replaced by a sudden collective silence, thick with confusion and a rising animalistic anxiety. And then, I heard it. It came from the space directly in front of the DJ booth, exactly where Flapper Girl had been dancing. It was a rapid, wet sound, a sickening thud, like a heavy bag of meat hitting the wooden floor, followed immediately by a short, muffled, frantic scream that was cut off mid-gasp, ending in a horrible final bubble of sound. It was too real, too close, too wet. The 100 people who had been dancing and laughing were now a single, terrified mass, shifting and murmuring in the pitch black. I could feel the cold prickle of terror on my neck. I pressed back against the metal railing, trying to make myself small, straining my eyes against the void. Finally, after what felt like an hour, the emergency lighting kicked in. They weren't the strong white lights of the main power grid, but weak, buzzing red exit signs and low-powered wall sconces that cast the huge room in a hellish, pulsating ruby glow. The change in the room was devastating. Flapper Girl was sprawled on the floor, no longer glamorous, just a broken mannequin in a silver dress. Her platinum wig was soaked through, but not with spilled vodka. Her head was lying at an impossible, grotesque angle. Her throat had been cleanly, brutally severed. The cut was impossibly precise, a wide, gaping red smile below her chin. Her blood was already forming a deep, dark pool that had begun to creep under the DJ's table. The crowd didn't scream this time. They didn't even gasp. They were silent. Every single person was frozen, their masked faces, devils, angels, ghosts, superheroes, now hiding a potential killer. The energy of the party had become the crushing inertia of guilt and suspicion. We were all trapped, staring at a gruesome professional murder scene, realizing that the assailant was one of us, still in the room, hiding in plain sight. The silence was the worst part. It stretched, taut and agonizing, broken only by the continuous maddening bzz's of the emergency lights. Suddenly, someone screamed from the back exit. Not a scream of fear, but a roar of panic, and the mass broke. The stampede was on. The narrow stairwell to the street became a funnel of clawing, desperate bodies. I hesitated, paralyzed by the sight of Flapper Girl's staring, lifeless eyes. I knew if I joined the rush, I'd be trampled. I looked around frantically, searching for the plainest, darkest costume, anything that looked out of place. But every shadow seemed to move, and every mask felt like a sinister, impenetrable disguise. Then, the second blackout. This time it wasn't a party trick. It was deliberate. The emergency lights died, plunging us back into that total, suffocating blackness. The shrieks of the crowd rushing the stairs were swallowed by the solid walls, muffled and distant. This time there was no chaotic music, no nervous laughter. There was only the sound of me trying to breathe, a ragged, loud noise in the emptiness. I could smell the metallic tang of the fresh blood, heavier now, thicker in the motionless air. And then, the sound began. Drip, a single, distinct sound of a liquid hitting the wooden floor. Drip, drip. It was close, horrifyingly close. It wasn't the slow seepage of the victim's blood. This sounded like blood dripping from an elevated point, perhaps a hand, or a weapon. Drip, drip, drip. The rhythm was measured, sickeningly deliberate. And the most terrifying part? The sound was moving. It was a slow, terrifying cadence that began near the DJ booth and was systematically, methodically closing the distance between itself and me. Drip, drip, drip. The sound was the killer's footsteps in the darkness, announcing their approach. Every droplet felt like a clock counting down my own death. I flattened myself against the railing, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The metallic odor grew stronger, overwhelming the smell of cheap beer. I could almost feel the presence, a cold, heavy shadow just inches from me. I imagined the black-clad figure, unseen, standing over me, their weapon held steady. The warm blood from the flapper girl still sheeting off the blade onto the wood right beside my foot. The drip stopped. The total silence was more terrifying than the noise. I could feel the heat radiating off my own skin as I hyperventilated behind the plastic mask. Then, I felt a feather-light brush of cold air on my bare neck, a sensation so subtle I almost dismissed it. A tiny momentary whoosh like someone had turned their head quickly looking for me. My instinct finally took over. I didn't scream. I simply ran. I didn't aim for the main stairwell. I burst through a flimsy, unlatched utility door near the railing and tumbled down a short, unused flight of wooden stairs, scraping my knees. Anything to escape the chilling, moving shadow that had hunted me by the sound of new blood. I didn't stop running until the flashing lights of police cars, called by the first wave of terrified guests, finally illuminated the street. I never saw the killer. But I survived the darkness, and now, years later, every time a faucet leaks, every time a simple droplet of water hits a hard surface, I don't hear water. I hear the drip, drip, drip of fresh blood, and I know that the person in the mask, the person who made that sound, is still out there, waiting for the next blackout. Waiting for the next blackout. The party was huge, overwhelming. It was held in the old Blackwood estate, a sprawling Gothic relic that smelled perpetually of damp wood and other people's secrets. I'm Jackson, and my date, Sarah, and I were maybe 2 hours into the chaos when the cheap plastic musk of the 100-odd costumes and the booming music became too much. We needed a breather. Let's find a place that hasn't been colonized by beer pong yet, Sarah suggested, pulling her crimson devil horns straight. We wandered away from the main ballroom and upstairs, following a winding, poorly lit hallway decorated only by shadows and the faint, unsettling scent of dust and mothballs. The music faded to a distant thump, thump, and the temperature dropped immediately. We found a small, unmarked door at the end of the hall. It wasn't locked. The room inside was a time capsule. It was clearly a forgotten parlor or bedroom, draped in white dust covers. The air was heavy, dry, and cold, carrying the sharp metallic odor of something very old. But amidst the covered furniture, one item remained starkly visible, gleaming faintly in the light spilling from the hallway. A massive, antique mirror. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, mounted in a thick, gilded frame that was chipped and tarnished, like cheap gold left out in the rain. The glass itself was murky and aged, giving back a softened, slightly green-tinged reflection. Sarah walked over, brushing dust from the frame. "Ooh, spooky. Don't look too long, Jackson. 7 years bad luck," she joked, but her voice was a little too loud, a little too bright in the unsettling silence of the room. I felt an immediate strange pull toward the glass. It wasn't curiosity. It was a kind of icy gravity. As I stepped toward it, I realized the room didn't just feel cold, it felt expectant. I stood before the old glass. My reflection stared back, a slightly blurry, dark-haired guy in a borrowed trench coat, my face partially obscured by the collar. But as I focused, the strange quality of the reflection became clear. It wasn't just blurred by age. It was distorted. My jawline was too sharp, my eyes were sunken too deep, and my complexion in the glass was pale, almost corpse-like, even though the real me was flushed from the party. "Whoa," Sarah murmured, coming up beside me. "You look awful in that thing. Like an old-timey vampire who forgot his sunscreen." I ignored her. Something was terribly wrong. My reflection was shifting, moving independently of my actions. I remained perfectly still, but the mouth in the glass began to twitch. Slowly, agonizingly, the distorted reflection of my mouth stretched sideways, pulling the lips taut into a slow, wide, menacing grin. It was a smile of pure, predatory malice, and it wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something wearing my face like a mask, Sarah gasped. Her playful mood evaporated instantly, replaced by sheer terror. Her eyes were fixed not on my face, but on the glass just behind me. "Jackson, look," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "Look at your reflection's hand." My reflection's hand. long, skeletal, and unnaturally pale, was lifting slowly. It wasn't the hand in the real world. My actual hand was hanging limply at my side. The reflection's hand rose until the bony fingers capped with dark, jagged nails rested lightly on the side of its own neck. My breath hitched. I watched in frozen horror as the mirrored fingers began to move, dragging downward. The reflection was tracing a bloody line across its own throat. A vivid, wet crimson immediately appeared on the pale skin of the glass version of my neck, spreading instantly, staining the white shirt visible beneath the lapels of the reflected trench coat. The grin in the glass widened, becoming something truly monstrous. The moment the reflected fingers finished their bloody cut, a blinding, razor-sharp pain erupted on my own throat. It wasn't a dull ache or a psychological trick. It was immediate, searing, and impossibly real, like 1,000 tiny shards of glass had just been driven into my neck. I stumbled backward with a guttural cry, clutching my throat instinctively. The force of the pain was so severe it knocked the wind out of me. I gasped, my fingers pressing against my neck, but the pressure was instantly useless. My hand came away slick and dripping. The warmth, the awful viscous wetness was undeniable. My fingers were instantly soaked in the thick metallic overflow of my own blood. I looked at Sarah, her face contorted in a silent scream, then back at the mirror in pure disbelief. The reflection was still there, the pale, distorted copy of me, still smiling that horrific, satisfied grin. But the bloody wound on its throat was now weeping profusely, a perfect, mirrored twin of the injury that was currently draining my life onto the ancient hardwood floor. Sarah finally found her voice, a raw, terrified shriek. She didn't look at the grinning reflection. She looked at the real me, dying rapidly at the foot of the mirror. As the room spun and the world went dark, my last agonizing thought was of Sarah's reflection, trapped eternally in the gilded glass, standing next to a monstrous reflection of me, now covered in my own pouring blood. That pale, grinning entity was real, and it was still watching us, ready to claim its next sacrifice. The last sound I heard before the darkness took me was the faint, cold whisper that seemed to come from behind the glass. Mine, the glass, mine. It was the perfect kind of Halloween night. Chilly, but not freezing, with just enough dampness in the air to make the bonfire smoke hang low and atmospheric. The setting was Derek's house, which was famous for its film-themed parties. This year's main event was the continuous screening of classic slasher movies projected onto a massive canvas strung up across the back deck. Facing the lawn, I'm Amy, and I was huddled on an outdoor sofa with my boyfriend, Ben. We were wrapped in a cheap blanket, passing a thermos of spiced cider, surrounded by about 50 other guests, vampires, ghosts, and superheroes, all staring up at the screen. The air smelled of burnt wood, cheap beer, and microwave popcorn. It was cozy, grounded, and familiar. We were deep into Nightmare Manor Fee, one of those films where the killer, the surgeon, wears a white porcelain doll mask and carries a gleaming, oversized surgical scalpel, a scene of gratuitous, suspenseful violence played out. A lone victim, stupidly separated from the group, cornered in a dimly lit shed. Ben and I both screamed in playful, synchronized terror when the surgeon lunged, the sound of the fictional stabbing cutting through the night air. It was a good scream, satisfying and loud, and it earned a few laughs from the people around us. I covered my face for a moment, waiting for the scene to transition. When I pulled my hands away, Ben didn't laugh. He just stared, his jaw slack, the color draining from his face even under his amateur zombie makeup. "Amy," he whispered, his voice thin and hollow. "That's not the movie." I followed his terrified gaze to the screen. The surgeon was still there, the scalpel still raised, but the background was completely wrong. Gone was the grainy 1980s film quality of the shed. The image was now sharp, clear, and sickeningly live. It was a chilling, high-definition feed of the back garden, just beyond the bonfire light. The victim was no longer a film actress. It was Sarah. Sarah, dressed as a tragic Greek goddess, had stepped out 15 minutes earlier to make a private call and have a cigarette. Now she was thrashing violently on the dark grass. The figure looming over her was wearing a mask identical to the one in the movie, the blank porcelain doll face, and holding a huge, impossibly gleaming metal object. The sound that had originally made us scream in playful horror was still echoing, But now it was muffled, real and desperate. We weren't watching actors. We were watching an attack in progress maybe 100 yards away. The crowd, which had been so noisy and self-assured, reacted with a terrible, delayed confusion. A wave of nervous laughter started, quickly building into a frenzy of excited chatter. "Holy cow!" Derek went all out. Someone shouted, impressed. "Is that a drone shot? This is insane. Where'd they hire the actors?" Ben and I were already on our feet, but the sheer volume of the party's excited rationalization was deafening. They genuinely thought it was an elaborate Halloween gag, a meta-horror performance piece. It's not a gag. Ben, look at the blood, I choked out, pointing. The camera, wherever it was hidden, was focused tight enough that we could see the details. The prop scalpel was far too big, far too sharp, and dripping a thick black fluid onto the grass that was definitely not stage blood. And the struggles of the actor Sarah were too raw, too choked with genuine agonizing terror. Then, the true horror escalated beyond any easy explanation. The figure in the porcelain mask finished its brutal, efficient work. Sarah stopped moving. The killer paused, their chest heaving visibly in the high-definition footage. Slowly, deliberately, the surgeon on the screen turned its head. It looked straight into the camera lens. The blank, unblinking eyes of the porcelain mask seemed to look directly through the screen and into the very depths of my soul. It was a silent, direct acknowledgement. It knew we were watching. Then, the killer raised the weapon, the heavy, blood-soaked scalpel, high above its head, catching the light from the back porch. The blood glistened, impossibly red, impossible to ignore. The party finally understood. The cheers stopped. The nervous chatter evaporated. The laughter died, leaving only 100 people frozen in a tableau of pure, gut-wrenching realization. The screams now were real, ragged and terrified. Ben grabbed my hand, his palms sweaty and cold. We have to run now, but we couldn't. We were stuck, compelled to watch the screen for the killer's next move. Like deer caught in headlights. The figure in the doll mask didn't run away, didn't panic, and didn't drop the weapon. It simply began to walk. It walked directly toward the source of the camera feed, which seemed to be positioned near the back door of the house, the only way back inside. The image on the screen showed the killer's boots disappearing from the frame, and the camera now focused on the empty, blood-soaked grass where Sarah lay. The silence in the garden on the screen was deafening. "He's coming inside," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "He's coming to the party!" The mob around us exploded. It was a desperate, self-preserving primal rush toward the front of the house. People clawed at each other, tearing off their costumes in their frantic bid for escape. Ben dragged me, pushing us through the choking bottleneck of the French doors leading back into the house. We made it into the kitchen, the noise and panic overwhelming. But as we scrambled past the granite countertop, I glanced back through the French doors toward the deck. The massive, projected image was still on the screen, the empty, damning view of the garden framed by the dark trees. But in the corner of the live feed, the shadow of the killer appeared. It was enormous, distorted by the angle, but perfectly recognizable, the high, raised shoulder of the mask, the silhouette of the massive weapon. Then I heard a new sound, cutting through the general din of the panic. The slow, deliberate, heavy thud of a back door being pushed open, not kicked in but opened with calm purpose. The sound was coming from the mudroom just off the kitchen, the exact room Ben and I were scrambling toward. I didn't wait. I dragged Ben away from the exit and slammed us both behind the long stainless steel island, burying ourselves among boxes of plastic cutlery. The panic was still roaring in the front of the house, drawing everyone away from the kitchen. We held our breath. The metallic smell of the chilly night air followed us, replaced now by the hot, cloying scent of pure fear. And then, I saw it. Just the edge of the white porcelain mask, slowly appearing around the mudroom doorframe. It wasn't rushing. It was moving with the slow, horrifying confidence of a hunter who knows its prey is trapped. The last thing I saw before I closed my eyes, pressing my face into the cold steel of the counter, was the reflection in the polished surface of the knife block, a distorted image of a white mask, now silently watching the terrified, chaotic scene. The live feed was still projecting the empty garden behind the house, an ironic, horrific monument to the fact that the real monster was no longer on the screen. He was in the room, and he knew exactly where we were. They used to call it the Bloodworth Estate, a name that perfectly suited my annual Halloween party. I'm Marcus, and hosting this thing was my form of seasonal performance art. The mansion was draped in velvet and shadow, and the air was thick with expensive cigar smoke, perfume, and the faint, metallic scent of the fog machine's blood spray. This year, my costume was a sophisticated, blood-splattered Wall Street tycoon, a commentary on the modern age, or so I told my guests. But the real star, the prop I'd spent weeks perfecting, was the hand. It was a hyper-realistic, medical-grade silicone mold of my own right hand, complete with painted veins, bruised knuckles, and a shockingly realistic severed wrist that dripped constantly with a slow, thick, non-staining theatrical blood gel. I had it wired inside my sleeve. The trick was simple. Offer a firm handshake, discreetly leave the prop in their palm, and then dramatically pull back my sleeve to reveal the bloody stump I'd fashioned around my actual wrist. I'd played the joke 4 times that night, and the shrieks of delighted horror were music to my ears. I felt like a god in my own grand, gruesome spectacle. Around 11:30, the party was at its drunken, dazzling peak. The ballroom was spinning with color and noise. I was moving through the crowd, accepting compliments on the realism of the fake blood. When I saw him, he was standing entirely apart from the glittering chaos, leaning against one of the carved marble columns that framed the entry to the main salon. He wore the simplest costume in the entire mansion, a plain, perfectly tailored black suit and a matte black, featureless half-mask that covered only his eyes and nose, leaving his jaw exposed. He was too dark, too still, and radiating a silence that felt heavy and wrong amidst the riotous noise. He was an unpainted canvas in a room full of masterpieces. I felt a sudden icy challenge. This was the perfect mark for the handshake trick. His seriousness would amplify the shock. I walked straight toward him, pushing through a small cluster of people dressed as neon jellyfish. As I got closer, the air around him seemed to drop a good 20 degrees. I smelled something sharp, like fresh iron and cold stone, overwhelming the perfume and smoke. "Welcome," I said, extending my right hand, the one concealing the prop. My voice sounded booming and false in the sudden pocket of cold air. "Marcus, glad you made it." Love the minimalist look. He didn't speak. He just slowly straightened up from the column, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that didn't feel quite human. He looked down at my outstretched hand, then he took it. He didn't just grasp the prosthetic. He waited until I had fully deployed the joke, leaving the silicone hand resting in his palm. But instead of dropping it in surprise or revulsion, he closed his fingers around it in a crushing, bone-jarring grip. A wave of intense, icy-cold dread washed over me. The grip wasn't just strong. It was wrong. It felt like shaking hands with a block of glacier ice, a grip that communicated not friendly greeting, but overwhelming lethal authority. I tried to pull my actual arm away, but his grip was absolute. "Pleasure," he rasped, the first word I'd heard him speak. His voice was a dry, hollow echo, like wind blowing through an empty sewer pipe. Then he released my hand. I stumbled back, heart hammering, my blood chilled to the core. The prop was gone, and I looked down, ready to laugh and show off the theatrical stump beneath my cuff. But the laugh caught instantly in my throat, where it turned into a sickly, disbelieving gasp. In his hand, the man in black wasn't holding the lightweight, hollow silicone prop. He was holding a hand, yes, but it was warm. It was heavy. It was glistening with a blood that was not thick theatrical gel, but thin, bright, and arterial. The crimson liquid dripped rapidly from the severed wrist onto the priceless Persian rug beneath his feet, staining the complex pattern instantly. The hand in his grasp was undeniably, horrifyingly real. And then I looked at my own wrist, where my right hand should have been, emerging from the cuff of my bespoke suit. There was only a clean, smooth, wet stump. No jagged tear, no bone fragments, no struggling circulation. Just a precise, brutally final cut, still slick with the runoff of my own life. I felt no pain. That was the most terrifying part. There was no agonizing scream, just a silent, mind-shattering shock. The connection to my hand, my entire reality, had been severed so cleanly, so completely, that the sensation was one of numb, icy emptiness, a horrifying void where flesh and bone used to be. The man in the black suit held the fresh, severed hand up to the light for a single, long moment, inspecting it with the casual disinterest of a man examining a receipt.
He was holding my hand, the real one, the one I'd just shaken his with. Then, he dropped it. The hand hit the rug with a soft, sickening slap.
The blood gushed out of the wrist onto the rug, mixing with the already heavy drips. The man didn't move. He simply tilted his masked head, the featureless black mask giving no indication of emotion, yet conveying an infinite, chilling understanding. He had completed the transaction. The exchange was final. The silence around us was broken by a piercing scream. A woman dressed as Marie Antoinette had seen the hand on the floor and the stump at my wrist. The panic ignited, consuming the ballroom instantly. People shrieked and scrambled backward, creating a widening circle around the man in black and the bloody evidence on the rug. I couldn't run. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring down at my arm, the blood pouring from the perfect wet circle where my wrist ended, staining my blood-splattered costume with a far more vital, devastating truth. The scent of hot coppery blood filled my nostrils, replacing the cigar smoke. When I finally managed to tear my eyes from the stump and look up, the man in the black suit was gone. He hadn't run. He had simply dissolved back into the shadows and the panicked crowd, leaving behind only the cold air and the warm, horrifying realization that the best, most terrifying prop of the night had been my own hand, taken by an uninvited guest who came for a deadly fee. I never found him, and I never saw my hand again. But sometimes, when I touch the smooth, cold scar of my wrist, I can still feel the icy pressure of that crushing grip, a constant reminder that something out there values an exchange far more than a simple joke, far more than a simple joke. The concept was called The Unmute, and it was meant to be the hottest Halloween event of the season. A silent disco rave held in a warehouse downtown, where everyone wore state-of-the-art noise-canceling headphones tuned to the same relentless electronic music. From the outside, I suppose we looked completely insane, 100 people gyrating and twitching in absolute silence, a ghost rave moving to a phantom beat. I'm Sarah, and I was deep in it. I was dressed as a glittering disco queen, all sequins and platform boots, and I was utterly lost in the music. The headphones were incredible. The sound was so sharp and clean it felt like the bass wasn't just thumping in my ears, but vibrating in the actual marrow of my bones. It was profoundly intimate, strangely isolating, and exactly what I needed after a rough semester. The anonymity of the massed crowd, the intensity of the music, the way everyone moved independently but together, it was hypnotic. I was grooving near the center of the main floor, my eyes half closed when the first flicker of unease snagged my attention. It was just a break in the peripheral motion. Every other person in the room was vertical, dancing, usually with wide, erratic arm movements. But I saw a flash of horizontal movement, low to the ground, near the perimeter of the dance floor, close to the emergency exit sign. I opened my eyes, still letting the pulsing beat guide my body. It's just someone dropped their phone, I reasoned, or maybe a couple making out on the floor. This was a college party, after all. But the movement was too deliberate, too heavy. I glanced over again. The area was darker, near a column draped with black fabric and plastic chains. Through the mass of costumed dancers I saw him, a figure in a cheap molded skeletal mask and a tattered black cloak. He wasn't dancing. He was pulling something. The sight, disconnected from any sound, was bizarre. I watched, my heart still beating to the furious rhythm in my ears. The killer, or actor I kept telling myself, was dragging a dark, heavy mass across the concrete floor. The way the mass snagged on a seam in the floor and the skeleton figure had to yank it free with a sudden, tense movement looked far too real for a prop. My fingers instinctively went to the volume dial on my headphones, but I stopped. If it was a gag, ripping off my headphones and yelling would ruin the performance and make me look like an idiot. The fear was a cold, sharp pinprick in my gut, battling with the pervasive urge to rationalize. The figure paused, shielded momentarily by a dancing zombie in a ripped tuxedo. The zombie was smiling, oblivious, entirely submerged in the silent, sonic void of his headphones. When the skeleton figure emerged, I saw the dragged mass more clearly. It was a person, still dressed in a shimmering blue mermaid costume, utterly motionless, folded unnaturally at the waist. And trailing behind them, smeared on the dusty concrete, was a streak of something dark, viscous, and glistening. My breath caught in my throat, a painful, soundless constriction. This wasn't fake. The tension, the weight, the stain, it was all wrong. My mind screamed, "Get out!" but my body was still rooted to the floor, my ears still drowning in the booming, deafening beat. I realized with paralyzing clarity that I was the only witness. 100 people were watching a brutal murder unfold, yet every single one of them was blind, deaf, and unreachable, trapped in their own bubble of sound. The silence was the killer's perfect accomplice. With a wrenching, desperate movement, I tore the headphones from my head. The immediate silence was worse than the music. It was a suffocating vacuum. The only sounds were the soft, pathetic squeak of sneakers on the concrete, the ragged gasp of my own lungs, and the distant, thin hum of the music leaking from everyone else's headphones. I screamed. It was a full-throated, raw shriek of terror and warning, aimed at the closest dancer, a guy in a Spider-Man mask. My voice felt loud enough to shake the walls, but Spider-Man just continued his slow, trance-like movement, head bobbing slightly. He didn't flinch. No one did. My scream had been absorbed entirely by the noise-canceling technology, reduced to nothing more than a private, useless sound. My gaze snapped back to the emergency exit. The skeleton-masked figure had almost reached the door, dragging the body with horrifying purpose. I could see the fresh trail of blood now, a dark, undeniable line marking the victim's final path. I pointed, screaming again, a panicked, desperate string of meaningless sound.
"Stop! Look! He's killing her!"
The killer stopped. He didn't stop because he heard me. He stopped because he was done moving the body. He looked down at the mermaid, then slowly, casually straightened up. He turned his head, the blank, grinning mask of the skeleton now facing the center of the dance floor, facing me. He saw me. He knew I had the headphones off. He knew I could see the truth that the 100 dancing fools around him were deaf to. He stood there for a beat that stretched into an eternity, completely unhurried, enjoying the silent understanding between us. Then, with a casualness that made my blood run cold, he reached down. His gloved hand dipped into the freshly spilled trail of blood on the floor. He brought the dripping, crimson-coated finger up to the molded plastic grin of the mask and slowly, deliberately drew a line of blood across the painted white teeth. It was a horrific, silent gesture, a promise, a signature, a warning. "You saw me, but you can't tell them, and now I'm coming for you." The gesture broke me. The utter stillness of the killer, the silent, terrifying confidence, was too much. I spun around, not caring about the other dancers, and started running blind for the main front exit. I felt the rough texture of the wall against my shoulder as I blindly followed the edge of the room. Behind me, the music from the headphones continued their inescapable pulsing thump, thump, thump. The sound was everywhere, yet nowhere. It was the sound of my own panic, amplified. I didn't hear footsteps chasing me. That was the worst part. I only heard the music leaking from the passing headphones, the soft scuffing of my own boots, and the frantic, shallow gasps of my breath. The silence was a cloak for him. He could be moving with the crowd, weaving silently toward me, his movements hidden by the noise that everyone else embraced. I burst through the front double doors and into the cold, empty street. I didn't stop running until I reached the next block. My lungs burning, my sequin costume snagging, I called the police. But I couldn't explain the killer. The silent complicity of the party, or the horrifying, bloody gesture he had made only for me. When the police eventually went back, they found nothing, no body, no blood, and only confused, slightly hungover college students who insisted the party had been a blast, except for the music being a little loud. Now, years later, I still can't listen to electronic music, but worse, every time I'm in a crowd, a city street, or a busy mall, I see people wearing noise-canceling headphones, and I freeze, because I know that they too are trapped in their own soundproof world, deaf to the horrors moving silently around them. And I always look over my shoulder, searching for the chilling, dark figure who proved that the most perfect hiding place is not the darkness, but the silence of the deafened. Silence of the deafened. The house on Black Creek Road wasn't just an abandoned building. It was an urban legend carved into warped clapboard and broken glass. Every Halloween, the story surfaced again. The house was built over an unmarked mass grave where a traveling religious commune had met a brutal end decades ago. They said the ground was poisoned and the foundation wept. That night, the air itself felt heavy, tasting of mold and wet decay. Even at the keg party 2 streets over. I'm Chris. I was there with my friends, Mike, Jenny, and Dave. We'd just done a round of shots, and Mike, perpetually the dumbest daredevil in the group, had decided the party was too safe. He slammed his plastic cup down, his face flushed beneath the cheap werewolf makeup. $50 to the first person who gets a picture from the attic of the Black Creek house, he challenged, grinning a little too wide. We knew it was stupid. The house was notorious, but we were young, fueled by liquor and the false bravado of Halloween night. Dave and Jenny chickened out, retreating to the comfort of the crowd. But Mike and I, dressed as a zombie and a Grim Reaper respectively, found ourselves walking toward the darkness. The front door of the house hung slack on a single hinge, groaning a welcome as the cold, black interior swallowed the sound of the distant party. Inside, the temperature plunged instantly. The air was thick and still, smelling intensely of old plaster, dust, and something wet and earthy, like exposed soil after a deep rain. Every step we took on the floorboards sounded like a rifle shot in the cavernous silence. We found the stairs after navigating the collapsed living room. They spiraled upward, narrow and dangerously decayed. The wood cried under our weight, each step an agonizing accusation. Mike led the way, his phone flashlight cutting a nervous, jumpy beam through the gloom. "This is awesome, man," Mike whispered, his voice vibrating with forced enthusiasm. "Think of the footage." I didn't answer. My heart was pounding not with excitement, but with genuine dread. The place wasn't just old. It felt occupied, not by people, but by a dense, palpable history that wanted us out. We finally reached the 3rd floor, finding a final, smaller flight of stairs leading to a low-ceilinged attic crawlspace. We squeezed up, pulling ourselves into a small, suffocating room nestled beneath the eaves. The space was utterly dark, lit only by our twin phone beams. The air here was dry, cold, and carried a metallic tang, like rust or old pennies. There was no furniture, except for one thing: a single, child-sized wooden rocking chair sitting directly in the center of the dusty floor. It was antique, stripped bare, and disturbingly small. We both froze. The silence was so profound it buzzed in my ears. Mike slowly raised his light, scanning the walls. That's when we realized this wasn't just storage. The walls were covered, not with wallpaper or dust, but with marks. Hundreds of them. They weren't cheesy props left over from a teenage seance. They were symbols. Crude, angular glyphs and swirling, repetitive patterns, drawn not in paint or marker, but in a dull, crusted substance that had darkened to a shade of disturbing, dried reddish-brown. It looked like old, desiccated blood. Mike, driven by his fatal curiosity, reached out his hand toward the nearest symbol, a jagged circle with radiating spokes. "Check this out," he breathed, his voice tight. "What kind of cult art is this?" The moment his fingertips brushed the dry, cold surface, the floor beneath us seemed to hiss with a sudden drop in pressure. And the rocking chair moved. It started slowly. A tiny, almost imperceptible creak. Then a slight, deliberate forward tilt, then back. Creak, creak. It was slow-motion horror, chilling us to the bone. The movement began to accelerate. Silently at first, then gaining a horrifying, insistent rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. The rockers were now slamming against the floorboards, fast and violent, shaking the small room. The noise was deafening, the sound of a trapped, frantic entity beating itself against its container. We scrambled backward, falling over each other, trying to get to the narrow hole we came through. Mike was screaming now, a choked high sound that barely left his throat. Then, the floor gave way. Not the entire floor, but a small, 4-foot section directly beneath the wildly rocking chair. The wood splintered violently, erupting inward with a sound like tearing bone and snapping cable. Dust, rot, and a rush of freezing air shot up. A blur of movement erupted from the void. It was an arm, or what resembled one. Dark, mottled, impossibly long, ending in a hand of horrifying, massive black claws. It shot out with blinding speed and slammed shut around Mike's ankle. "No! Get it off!" Mike shrieked, thrashing against the floor, his werewolf mask ripping off his face. I grabbed him under the arms, pulling with all my strength. The creature's grip was impossible, like the hand was anchored to granite. I felt the wet, sticky heat of blood immediately soak the sleeve of my Grim Reaper costume. The claws were sinking into his flesh, tearing through his cheap jeans and into the tendons. I heard the sickening, unmistakable sound of skin and muscle ripping. "It's pulling," Mike screamed, his voice dissolving into a gurgling plea. I pulled harder, my muscles burning, Dave's frantic voice echoing uselessly from the floor below. But the force from below was absolute. It was the pull of gravity, the pull of the grave itself. With a final sickening tug, Mike's ankle was jerked violently downward. His screaming stopped mid-wail, replaced by a wet, hollow thump from the black abyss. I collapsed backward, landing hard on the remaining floorboards. I was holding nothing but air and the severed, blood-soaked fabric of his jeans. I scrambled to the edge of the hole, shining my light down into the blackness. There was no sound, no movement, just the dizzying depth of the earthen void and the glint of blood on the splintered wood. Mike was gone. I don't remember climbing back down the stairs. I remember the frantic, dizzying run back to the party, tripping over my costume, screaming a warning that was dismissed as a Halloween prank. I stood under a porch light, breathing in ragged sobs, looking at my hands. They were slick, dark and sticky, covered in the blood of my friend, which smelled exactly like the rusty metallic tang in the attic. The police found the house empty the next day. No child's chair, no blood on the floor, only a suspicious, freshly patched section of floorboard in the attic, surrounded by dust so thick it looked untouched. But I know what I saw. I know what lives beneath the Black Creek house, waiting in the silence. And I know the horrifying truth that some things don't stay buried in a mass grave. They wait to pull you into it, to pull you into it. The manor was Jessica's masterpiece. Every year, her exclusive Halloween gala was the pinnacle of old money social events, a place where the wealthiest, most influential people in the city traded secrets and champagne. The rules were strict: black tie, period costumes, and absolutely by name only on the list, vetted and double-checked by 3 layers of security. I'm Eleanor, and as Jessica's closest friend, I was there not just as a guest, a relatively boring 1920s jazz singer, but as her unofficial second-in-command, watching the flow. The room felt safe, saturated with money, power, and the illusion of impenetrable security. The ballroom was a whirl of silk, sequins, and expensive custom masks. The air was warm, smelling of lilies and scotch. By midnight, the party had reached its crescendo, laughter spilling over the string quartet, the clinking of crystal, the collective, ecstatic high of the elite. That's when I saw the disruption. He was standing perfectly still by the massive, carved mahogany fireplace in the east wing. Every other guest was a riot of color and intricate detail, but this man was an absence. He wore a simple, utterly plain black cloak and hood, the fabric heavy and matte, absorbing all the ambient light. He had no mask, yet his face was entirely obscured, swallowed by the deep shadow of his hood, a space darker than the room itself. He wasn't holding a drink, he wasn't talking, and he wasn't moving. He was simply there. The silence he radiated felt like an anomaly, a pocket of absolute cold in the overheated ballroom.
I watched him for nearly 5 minutes, the pit of my stomach tightening with a vague, unreasonable dread.
He was not on the list. I knew everyone who was supposed to be here. Jessica, dressed as a decadent blood-red Queen Elizabeth I, noticed the break in her perfect tableau. She frowned, her eyes, always sharp, always assessing, locked onto the figure. She signaled to a bodyguard, but before the security detail could move, Jessica, fueled by the cocktail of indignation and host responsibility, decided to handle it herself. "Stay here, Ellie," she murmured to me, her voice tight with professional annoyance. I watched her approach the figure, her expensive gown swishing over the marble floor. The firelight from the huge hearth provided the only illumination. She paused 3 feet away, giving him the chance to excuse himself before she escalated the matter. "Excuse me," Jessica whispered, polite but firm. "I don't believe I recognize your costume." "Who are you with?" The figure didn't flinch. He didn't respond to the question. Instead, he did something worse. He slowly, deliberately turned his head toward her. As the movement shifted the angles, the ambient firelight, that warm, natural light, caught the edges of his cloak. That's when Jessica gasped, a sharp, choked sound that was instantly drowned out by the noise of the party. I saw it too. The lining, the deep creases of the heavy fabric were stained an awful, crusted crimson. Not stage blood, but something thick, old, and dried to a shade of disturbing decay. Then, the low, guttural rasp finally broke the silence. It wasn't a human voice, but something scraped out from deep in the chest, like gravel shifting over a metal plate. "I am here for the debt." The words were so clear, so final, they seemed to pierce the music and the laughter just for us. Jessica recoiled, her face instantly drained of color, fear finally overriding her composure. Before she could even step back, before I could scream, the figure's hand shot out. It moved with the impossible speed and economy of a striking viper. But the hand did not touch Jessica. It didn't even seem to move toward her. Instead, the motion was quick, effortless, and terrifyingly precise. Directly behind Jessica, a man, a lobbyist, dressed in a cheap, silver robot costume, had been laughing loudly, his hand resting on a cocktail tray. His laughter suddenly ceased. The metallic sound of the impact was completely lost to the volume of the string quartet. But the effect was immediate and horrifying. The figure's hand was now empty, resting casually back under the cloak's cuff, and in the very center of the robot's throat, where the aluminum plating met the flesh of his neck, a throwing knife was now embedded to the hilt. The blade was slender, dark, and utterly silent. The robot man didn't even fall immediately. He just stood there swaying, a thin stream of scarlet blooming instantly onto the silver plating. Then he dropped the tray, the sound of the shattering glass finally cutting through the party noise, followed by the heavy, sickening thud of his body hitting the floor. Silence, real absolute silence, finally descended on the ballroom, freezing the 100 guests mid-dance, mid-sip, mid-laugh. They stared at the spreading pool of bright, fresh blood. Jessica was screaming now, a high, thin sound of pure terror. She stumbled backward, tripping over her dress, pointing a trembling finger at the cloaked figure. The figure looked down at the dead man, then back up at Jessica. He tilted his shadowy head slightly. The payment had been collected. I didn't wait. The party was over. It wasn't a party anymore. It was a silent hunting ground, and we were all just prey. I pushed past Jessica's collapsing body and ran, not toward the front door and the security guards, but toward the relative darkness of the unused library. I hid beneath a heavy writing desk, listening to the new sounds, the high-pitched, collective panic of the wealthy, followed by new, muffled screams and two distinct wet, sickening thuds. The firelight flickered, catching the shadow of the executioner moving slow and deliberate. Working his way through the frozen crowd, the debt was being paid, and I didn't know who owed it or how many names were on the ledger. All I knew was that the uninvited guest was still in the house, walking silently through the chaos, ready to pluck the life out of anyone whose name was called. I remained huddled there for hours, listening to the sounds of collection, the low, cold hum of his presence, the only proof that the blood spilled that night was entirely, horribly real. The annual Harvest Festival party was always the same. Too much cider, too many cheap string lights, and too many people crammed into Farmer Giles's barn. But the real tradition, the one everyone looked forward to, was the hazy, drunken, end-of-the-night pilgrimage through the adjacent pumpkin patch. It was the unofficial walk of shame, or sometimes the beginning of a bad mistake. I'm Alex. That night, I was dressed as a hastily put-together scarecrow, and by 2 a.m. I was stumbling more than walking. Beside me were David and Sam, my two best friends. David was barely holding on to his shoddy ghost sheet, and Sam's plastic vampire fangs kept threatening to make her gag. The air in the barn had been thick with sweat and straw, but as we pushed through the flapping plastic sheet that served as the back entrance, the night air hit us, clean, cold, and smelling sharply of damp earth and rotting squash. I need coffee. I need 3 days of silence, Sam mumbled, her voice muffled by the collar of her cape. No, Sam. You need to admire Giles's magnum opus, David slurred, gesturing vaguely ahead. The pumpkin patch was not flat. It rose and fell in gentle, muddy waves, crisscrossed by tangled vines that threatened to trip the unwary. Our flashlights, bouncing weakly in our drunken hands, illuminated dozens of plump orange gourds. But as we got deeper into the field, everything grew darker, the ambient noise of the party fading until the only sound was the soft squelch of our shoes pulling free of the mud. The field felt vast, cold, and strangely silent, like stepping into a different landscape entirely. Then we saw it. Near Near the dark tree line at the far edge of the field sat the centerpiece. It was an enormous pumpkin, easily 3 feet high and wide, the kind that won prizes. It was intricately carved, not with some cheesy smile, but with a complex, terrifying grin that seemed to twist and sneer in the dark. It was glowing from within, the light flickering violently, giving its monstrous face a lifelike demonic quality. "Holy hell, look at that detail," David whispered, the alcohol-induced slurring momentarily gone. Giles must have spent days on that. We stumbled closer, pulling our masks askew to get a better view. The closer we got, the more the glowing light seemed to command the space. The flickering was too intense, too quick for a standard votive candle. "Wait, the light. It's not wax," I said, squinting. "It's shining. Reflective." We stopped about 5 feet away, the silence between the three of us suddenly heavy, thick with apprehension. I leaned in, my scarecrow hat catching on a dry branch. The color of the pumpkin skin around the intricate carving was wrong. It wasn't the bright orange of the others. It was a dull, mottled brown, sticky-looking and strangely fibrous. It looked less like the hard shell of a pumpkin and more like exposed tissue. Sam gasped, low and sharp. She hadn't noticed the color. She was looking at the bottom edge of the glowing cavity.
Alex, that's not a candle.
"That's metal." It was a sharp, glinting edge catching the faint reflection of the distant moonlight nestled right inside the carved space. But the realization that slammed into me was worse than the metal. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the pumpkin wasn't round at the bottom. It had a distinct, unnatural neck-like shape, jammed brutally down onto a broken vine stump. And the brown, sticky substance was not decay. It was old, clotted blood. The centerpiece of the patch wasn't a carving at all. It was a freshly severed human head, skinned and drained, with a horrifying, manic face crudely carved into the flesh, held in place by its own neck. The metallic glint inside was the reflected surface of a sharp, wide blade sitting at the base of the skull. The horrifying truth made the air around us feel instantly frozen. Scrapey. The sound was sudden, loud and brutally metallic, the noise of steel dragging heavily across rough dirt, coming from the dense shadow directly behind the gigantic, gruesome centerpiece. "Run," I croaked, the sound barely escaping my throat. David turned instantly, but he was too slow, too drunk. A tall, gaunt figure emerged from the black shadow of the trees. He wasn't wearing a costume. He was wearing a heavy dark canvas apron, stained black with gore, and a wide-brimmed hat that swallowed his face. In one hand he held a massive, wicked-looking farming hook. In the other, he was dragging a person, Sam. She must have been the closest to him when he emerged. She was wearing her cape, her body lifeless and limp. Her neck was already a horrific open mess, and the dark, wet trail she left on the earth proved he had just harvested his next piece. David screamed and bolted, slipping in the mud, trying to backtrack toward the party. I turned to follow, but the killer was already moving with terrifying speed and purpose. He didn't even drop Sam's body. He simply swung the heavy hook. The force of the blow was sickeningly audible, a crunch followed by a wet, tearing sound as the hook caught David in the small of his back, ripping through his thin ghost sheet and into his spine. David collapsed, crying out only once before the killer hauled him back in with an easy, callous yank. I didn't stop to help. I couldn't. The sight of the killer, silent and methodical, dragging 2 bodies toward his gruesome, illuminated carving, turned my terror into a primal urge to survive. I scrambled over the muddy mounds, slipping, crying soundlessly into my scarecrow mask. My last glimpse before I broke free of the dense patch was over my shoulder. The killer had arrived at the centerpiece. He was already working, kneeling down with the drag hook, gently pushing Sam's limp body with his boot. He was going to add her to his collection. The light from the carved face, the one that wasn't a pumpkin, flickered once, illuminating the killer's shadowed figure as he reached for his knife, ready to carve his latest gourd. The sight of that massive, smiling, silent collection, a gruesome, unspeakable harvest, is the last thing I remember before I hit the road and ran until the sound of my own heart was the only noise left in the cold night. I survived the harvest festival, but I left my friends there. And every year, when the leaves turn brown and the air gets crisp, I know that centerpiece is back, sitting in the dark, patiently awaiting the next victim to stumble back into the silent, terrifying pumpkin patch.